Hello.
Hello.
Hello. So today it's Karen again from Wise Women Weekdays, and with my co-host, first time for Rebekah.
Hello.
And we've been invited into Jonathan Davis's house. Thank you very much. We're sitting here with Jonathan. Hello.
It is my pleasure to see you both.
It's lovely to be here with beautiful biscuits and cakes and what have you. We've already been chatting, haven't we, about ancestry, bits and bobs, but we're here really to talk about wealth management, because that's how would you describe yourself? What are you, a wealth manager? Is that your sort of title?
I'm a wealth advisor. My practice is I help wealthy people get wealthier.
Wow.
I save them tax. I make them money in their investments. In essence.
Mm-hmm. And how did you get into that to start with? Do you have to be a wealthy person to do that? Is that a silly question, or can you start?
Do I have to be a wealthy person to do it?
Yeah, really.
Well, if I was wealthy, I wouldn't be doing it. I'd be in Barbados. But no, I started when I was 24, which is donkeys ago.
Right.
A couple of years after university. As to how you get into it, these days, I imagine you get into it by taking some exams and starting at the bottom
and working up.
Well, I imagine so.
But that's not what you did. If you started at university, was that your aim? You thought, I want to be
No. I'd already been doing working in the financial world for 11 years before I realised, yes, I'll do this for the rest of my life.
Right. Okay.
So I'm one of these people who had absolutely no idea what he wanted to do, and just kept looking for ways to develop my career until I said, yes, I can do something with this, and I quite enjoy this part of it, so I'll focus on this part.
Mm-hmm. So it's going well for you, obviously.
It's relative.
Well, it's when you said, because you live in a very beautiful part of the world, don't you? It's beautiful.
East Sussex, yeah, East Sussex. Fantastic.
And you've moved on recently. Was it in Surrey?
It was in Hertfordshire. We've moved from what we call north of the river to south of the river.
Right, south of the river. So I think Hertfordshire is also very beautiful. Mm. And you're saying, when I'm saying, do you have to be wealthy to do the work, or your clients or customers or whatever, clients rather than customers? I don't know why there is a difference. Do you know why somebody's a client and why somebody's a customer?
I would suggest a customer places an order, whereas a client receives advice.
Right, that does make sense. Okay. So your clients, they already have a certain degree of wealth before they come to you?
At least £500,000.
Wow, we better go.
In investable funds.
In investable funds?
Outside of property and non-investable assets.
Right, okay. So
in my case, but I'm relatively unusual in that there are many folk who ostensibly technically do what I do, but at a lower level, who will start with a, I don't know, £100 a month pension.
Yeah.
Quite right too.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's got to start from somewhere, hasn't it?
Absolutely.
It's like a house, you build the foundation and then you grow slowly. So do you think, because the world being topsy-turvy, that's my description of it.
It's one way of putting it.
It is one way of putting it. It has gone a bit funny, hasn't it, recently? Things have sort of
absolutely
moved around in funny ways. How has this affected you, not so much personally, but for your clientele? Or has it? Have the rich got richer?
Yeah, very much so. The 2020 that they pretend there was a pandemic, which of course there wasn't. You may or may not know that in March of 2020 there was a ginormous stock market collapse. It was the quickest and largest crash in stock prices globally from the all-time highs in just 4 weeks. On average, stock markets fell about 35-45% in a month. And of course, they blamed it on the scamdemic. Your question was, have the rich got richer? Words to that effect. America in 2020 printed $10,000 billion, 10 trillion. 40% of it went to the top 1%. So the whole scamdemic was to bail out the rich who had lost a lot of wealth, it's all relative of course, in the stock market crash.
That's amazing, because it's stuff we don't really hear about, isn't it?
Well, actually, I'd forgotten, because I do remember the stock market took a tumble, but I'd actually forgotten about it, which is, I think, convenient. People do forget a lot of stuff, don't they?
That's because, and I write about it all the time, the media clearly doesn't want people to know the reality. And, 35% went to the bottom 90%. 35% of the 10 trillion went to the bottom 90%. And of course, the populace, we in Britain, I'm talking about America because it's round numbers, we in Britain and Europe and Australia, Canada, everyone was effectively bailed out. And everyone thought, oh, well, it's okay, we go back to normal. And that's effectively, people forgot about it. But the reality was, it was all to bail the rich out. 'Twas ever thus. Please don't imagine for one moment that I'm one of these permanent doomsayers. We're all going to die. We're going to, the Mayan thing, we're going to get done over in 2012. I'm not like that. In fact, I'm an eternal optimist, even though I'm incredibly pessimistic, curiously. But there are people who are going to win, and they're going to be the tiny minority, and there's going to be people who are going to lose, and they're going to be by far, unfortunately, the bulk of the populace.
That's interesting.
'Twas ever thus.
'Twas ever thus. We were talking about that driving up, weren't we? Just saying how in certain situations, whether with what's just happened over the last few years, but through time immemorial, it's always obviously the poor that has suffered.
Well, let's go back. It's only in the last couple of 100 years that you and I have had more than one meal a day. And until literally the 18th century, from the caveman through the Abyssinians, the Egyptians, the Romans, the Dark Ages, it's only until the 18th century. What you had, of course, was royalty, the courtiers, and then everyone else. And only these people had any wealth. Everyone else was scraping by. Now, don't get me wrong. The historical dramas on the TV and the movies will suggest that we were all starving and dying at 35. Up until the 18th century. Actually, if you worked the farm, you actually had a pretty good life.
Yeah.
You were healthy. This 35, everyone died at 35, actually included all the stillbirths. So actually, Isaac Newton, he lived to 70 odd. And that was in fact more or less the norm, as it happens. So if you worked the land, you had a reasonable life. You had the local community. The Morris dancers. It wasn't actually that bad. Of course, when the factories came and you had the 6-year-old kids under the looms and all, and the mines, and
chimney sweeps.
Well, yeah, but at least with chimney sweep you can see the light and you can get out. But when you're in the mine and there's no light, and that was, of course, horrendous beyond belief. We can't even imagine it, even though, of course, that is happening today in other parts of the world today, partly to fuel our lifestyles or fund our lifestyles, interestingly. But even then, give it 50, 100 years, in other words, 2 or 3 or 4 generations, and our prosperity generally grew. By the second half of the 19th century, we were an incredibly prosperous nation. People were actually well off. The middle classes had come out of the poor, the poverty-stricken. All of a sudden, we had a middle class. Forever, for tens of thousands of years, until the 18th, 19th century, there wasn't a middle class. Then all of a sudden there was. they like to call themselves the elite. I call them the parasites. The parasites decided a few decades ago that the populace have had it too good for too long. And they decided, well, it's about time we took back control. And we are rapidly heading back to feudalism, which is what we had forever until 100, 150 years ago.
Bread and circus, wasn't it, really?
For example.
Bread and circus. So therefore, if you are, and do come in if you've got any questions, because I'm very good at sort of taking over. And we've got a little list here, but we might not need it because you're doing pretty good here, just educating me already. And I forgot what I was going to say. Yeah. So if you're coming from a wealthy background, or sorry, your career, you're dealing with wealth.
Yeah, because I don't come from a wealthy background.
No, you've worked but the way you live your life is quite affluent, I guess. Is it? You have quite a nice
these
lifestyle.
Days, yeah.
So, would you put yourself in middle class? You're not working class?
Anyone who works is middle class.
Anyone who works.
Okay, I'm not saying that the likes of Tom Cruise, who works, is in middle class. But, one of the points of being rich is that you have a party every single day of your life. If you feel like it, you go and see U2 in that new Sphere in Las Vegas, and it costs you $50,000. So what if you're a billionaire? Yeah. So what? That is what life is like, to be rich. Vanessa Feltz once asked me live, how much do you have to have? Okay, this was about 10 years ago. How much do you have to feel comfortable? Well, I had to think quickly on my feet, and I said, well, I imagine, frankly, £700,000. And I know that's a lot of people. That's a lot of money to a lot of people. But the question was to be comfortable. And of course, you have to have it secured, and it's not going to get lost with inflation and whatever. And
that you're talking £700,000 in the bank? That's when you've also got your house, or you could live off £700,000.
I think in financial assets as well as your property.
Yeah.
And I know to a lot of people that's going to, this guy's not living in the real world. Actually, that is the real world.
Yeah.
Because most people are finding it increasingly difficult. For 14 years, we basically had no cost of borrowing. Interest rates were effectively zero for 14 years, from 2009 to early 2022. 13 years. People spent their spare money, their extra money. They should actually have been saving and not going on extra holidays and not going out all the time.
Buying new cars.
All that kind of stuff. But what they did was they spent their future money, and who doesn't want to have a great lifestyle? I'm not judging. I'm just stating economic analysis conclusions. Unfortunately, we're at the stage now where the workers, and that's people who go up to £500,000 a year, the workers are now tightening their belt, and we haven't seen anything yet.
You predicting, well, it is predicted that we're going to have the biggest economic crash that we've seen in our lifetime.
Some people may be saying that. What I've been writing and saying is that we will have the biggest economic recession in decades. Everyone points to 2008 as being the last big crash, which lasted more than a nanosecond, as in 2020, which lasted just a month, as I've just been explaining. 2008 was absolutely the biggest financial collapse in history. And indeed, if you go into my website, you'll see that, through 2007, I became the UK media's go-to guy to laugh at, because I was saying we're going to hell in a handcart.
Yeah.
So they'd have me on their programs, TV and radio and press and whatever, to laugh at me, and then this Ponzi guy with red braces or whatever, with a Oxbridge voice, would come and say, oh no, it's not a problem. It's just a hiccup. And then, of course, Northern Rock went bust in December of 2007. Well, they stopped laughing at me, but then they took me seriously through 2008. And then we had the biggest financial collapse in history. But it wasn't actually that big an economic recession, because as soon as Lehman Brothers went bust in October of 2008, and then AIG, Lehman's was the fourth largest American investment bank, went bust. AIG, the largest insurance company in the world, went bust a few weeks later. Immediately, globally, the central banks slashed interest rates in the UK from 5% to 0.5% within a few months. This was the fastest slashing of interest rates in history. They kept the rates practically there for the next 13, 14 years. And of course, what that did was, as well as the massive printing of money, it bailed everyone out, particularly the rich. But the populace felt, oh, well, everything's going to go okay now. Whereas I kept saying all they've done is they've kicked the can down the line.
Yeah.
And the chickens are now coming home to roost. Do you want to talk now about what it's going to be like?
Yes. I think there's a lot of fear, and I feel it as well, about what's coming down the line at us with digital currencies, and people saying buy gold, buy silver, buy copper, buy anything that isn't fiat currency. And I try not to feel it, but I do. It's getting into my bones. So yes, I'd like to get a professional opinion on what you think is coming at us, because I'd rather know than not know.
So you can prepare yourself.
Indeed.
As best as possible. Yeah.
Like a girl guide.
Yeah. Start growing some veggies.
Be prepared.
Be prepared.
Be prepared, that one.
I never did any of them, actually. It's
I think it's that one. Just 3. Yeah.
Is that all we had as guides?
I was never a guide or a brownie. They didn't have them in New Zealand.
So there's a number of issues. The gold, the crypto, Bitcoin thing, CBDC, central bank digital currency, that is kind of separate to the general economics and financial markets. That's about power and control. That's about the feudalism. And as a wealth advisor, and indeed in my own affairs, I have to work on the basis that I can see the relatively near term, the next few years, CBDCs and the breakdown of society, quote unquote, is likely to come. And by the way, in my language, likely means between 75 and 99% probability. Certainty means 100% probability. So it's likely to all happen. But for now, for the medium term, the next few years, we can still focus on building our wealth, building our financial security, and then keeping it away from the feudalists, keeping our money away from the feudalists is a separate issue.
And the feudalists being?
Well, the parasites. Yeah.
Just for clarity.
Sure. Let's just go back a stage, first of all, in order to go forward a stage. We've just had 2 generations from the 1970s to literally 2020 of falling inflation, falling interest rates. In the 1970s, not that you ladies will remember the 1970s, I can vaguely remember eating dinner by candlelight, the 3-day week, the power strike, because, in the 70s, before Maggie, this was a communist country, whatever they may pretend it was a communist country. The state owned the coal, the gas, the oil, the power workers, the truckers. The state owned it all. And because of what governments had done from the second half of the 50s through the 60s for example, the Vietnam War, which cost an arm and 3 legs, and because governments borrowed like crazy, that created enormous inflation. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes time to come into the system. Through the 60s, by the 70s, we had, in the UK, it peaked at 25% per annum inflation. And although the government then were, they were offering the workers 15, 18% after per annum wage rises, clearly after 2 or 3 years, finally the workers realised that their purchasing power was diminishing.
Yeah.
So they said, enough's enough, we're going on strike, whatever. Since the mid to late 1970s globally, we've seen inflation fall, the annual rate of inflation. That doesn't mean that prices have fallen. It just means that the annual rate of increase in prices has fallen, and also interest rates have fallen. We call this disinflation, falling inflation, as distinct from deflation, which is falling prices. Okay, and with falling interest rates for decades, I mean, in the UK, mortgages peaked around 18%, and by the beginning of 2022, they were down to what, 1.5%.
I remember it. I bought my first flat when I was 25, and the interest rates went up so high. And my friends, because I'd always encouraged them to buy property. My dad was a banker, and for some reason, I had the insight to buy a little flat which had 2 bedrooms, which I still have, so that I could always rent it out, which I did, and that saved me. Whereas my other friends, I had to give the keys back to the bank, and I've still got my little flat. But I was living off, like, I'd make a bowl of chili, and I'd be living off that a week. I had, like, I don't know, 15 quid a week. But I was young, and I thought, oh, I didn't have a mum and dad that could have perhaps bailed me out, but they didn't. I worked my way, but I remember.
So I'm going to guess, was that the early 90s?
Oh, probably.
30 years ago?
Yes, it was, I was 25. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, indeed. So yes, I mean that was a major recession. It was a house price crash, early 90s. Interest rates soared for a few years. And there had been a big rise in house prices in the 1980s, late 80s, so it just tumbled over. So for 40 odd years, asset prices just rose. Property just rose, commercial, residential, share prices just rose, because as interest rates fall, it doesn't just help people who want to buy homes, who, if the interest rate goes from 3% to 1%, you can not just pay for a 100,000 mortgage, you can now pay for a £200,000 mortgage. So of course the sellers know this, so they raise the prices. Okay, yeah. So if you can get a lot of money to buy, you can pay the asking price.
Yeah.
Okay, and also for businesses, you could borrow cheaper and cheaper. They could invest, they could take over other companies, profits grew, and everyone did very nicely for decades. Pensions went up, house prices went up. We were all wealthier, except, of course, the level of debt multiplied decade after decade. And, those chickens, they're now roosting.
Yeah, sure.
Because what happened from March of last year, interest rates started rising. Why? Because the sheer amount of money that governments handed to people into their back pockets post the scamdemic, post the lockups. I don't call it lockdown, it was imprisonment. It was locked up.
I agree to that, yeah.
That going into people's back pockets, that's what created huge relative inflation in 21 and 22. By last year, we had inflation which we hadn't seen for 40 years. So where we are now, for example, most people can relate to mortgage rates. Mortgage rates a year and a half ago were 1.5%. They're now 5.5%. Now, lots of people in the freedom movement will say inflation's now going to go like Zimbabwe, Venezuela, we're going to get, or Argentina's in the news, we're going to get 100% hyperinflation, interest rates are going to go to 50%. These people are selling their agenda. They're not educating anyone. They're selling their podcast, they're selling their newsletters, they're selling their books, whatever they're selling. They're not educating anyone in the reality. The reality is that for 3 decades, up until 2020, 28 out of 30 years we had sub 3% inflation. The other 2 years were sub 5%. So we had very low inflation. Let's put it this way, we had between 0 and 5% inflation annually for decades. We have now moved from 2021 onwards for the next generation to between 5 and 10% per annum inflation, which is actually a major step change. For example, what's the result of that? Well, we're not going to have 1.5% mortgages. Yes, the mortgage rate today of 5 to 6% will come down, because in the economic recession, which I'm just about to explain, interest rates will be cut in order to try and get things moving again, because that's what they do. Interest rates will be cut, mortgage rates will come down, and so on. And they might even go back down to, say the base rate today is 5.25 in Britain. It might go down to, say, 1% or 2%, bearing in mind it was effectively zero for nearly a decade and a half. However, whatever it goes down to, it'll go down to a level materially higher than it has been for as long as people basically can remember. And for this generation that we are now in, that started in 2021, so take that through to the 2040s, expect interest rates to be, instead of 0 or 0.5%, to be more like 2 or 3%. And mortgages, instead of being 1.5%, to be more like 1.5 to 3%, to be more like 2.5 to 4%. Now, you know, in your head you might think, well, that doesn't sound too terrible. Well, in one sense it's not. However, in the short term, and most people don't know this because the media don't tell them, but house prices peaked a year and a half ago in the spring of 22. And although that's not reflected in the indices, it's because the indices are months behind reality. House sales transactions are down 20 to 30% from a year ago. Mortgage approvals for house purchases are down 35%. Actual house transaction prices are down 10 to 15% from the peak last year. Another reason why it's not reflected in indices is because the number of cash purchases has shot up as a proportion of the entirety, and cash purchases are much lower than prevailing prices. Yes? And auction sales are through the roof as well. Again, so actual transaction prices are 10 to 15% below the peak, and house prices are going to continue crashing steadily, 0.2%, 0.5%, 0.7% a month for the next 1.5 to 3 years. And that's just one example of the effect of, a hugely indebted society going from 0% to 5.25% in 15 months. It's going to create havoc. We're already now finally, in the economic cycle, we're seeing unemployment rising. It will soar. We've seen the stock market crash and build a little bit or quite a bit, but it will crash again. The stock market peaked over 2 years ago. People don't know about this. Housing market peaked a year and a half ago. Nobody knows. For example, you mentioned gold. Gold is flat for the last 3 years, and yet everyone talks about gold. Bitcoin's down 50%. Bitcoin's down 50%. Who knows about it? They never talk about the peaks. They talk about where they bought the last amount. They bought at $20,000. It's now $35,000. They never say it was up at 70,000 or 68. Okay, everyone's got an agenda. By the way, I have no agenda, and that's why I could go on TV and radio and say the things that no one in the city would say, because I don't have their agenda, and I've got no board of directors telling me I can say this and I cannot say that. I am my board of directors.
How do you have all this information? Is it just through your experience, because history repeats itself?
I'm an economist, and I 75% of my life is sitting at my desk, and probably 35% of my life is just reading what the hell's going on in the world.
Right. So you've been curious for a start, really looking into it.
Well, indeed. Your viewers, their pension funds are going to fall 25 to 50%. They've already fallen 10 to 20% over the last couple of years. Their house prices are going to fall 20, 30%. Many are going to lose their jobs.
Do you think also furlough had a lot to do with this, because they were just making money and just palming it or passing it?
Well, again, that's part of the trillion, the tens of trillions globally that was printed and just handed to people's back pockets. If you pay people to literally produce nothing, inevitably that's an inflationary. So they're spending, but they're producing nothing into society.
Exchange. And also, I think I'm assuming most people watching this, well, I don't know, but where money comes from, that's kind of a bit of an eye-opener, isn't it? Because it is not what we think, is it? Okay. If you can explain exactly where money comes from.
I will.
Because do you understand about money?
I've done a fair amount of research.
Right.
I'm not an expert by any stretch of imagination.
Yeah, because you've kind of blown us away with all your information. But
yes, I'll explain that. But make sure we come back to the longer implications for the economy and for people.
Yeah.
But money comes from thin air.
Yeah.
There's money
from a tree. Yeah.
You push a button and there's
Ones
money.
and zeros.
Yeah.
Only 3% of money comes from the Bank of England.
I didn't know any of it came from the Bank of England, actually.
97% of money comes from the commercial banks and building societies. So you go to them and say, I want 10,000 to buy that car. They push a button and all of a sudden it's in your account.
Doesn't exist.
No, it doesn't exist.
Right. In 1985 or 86, we had a thing in the markets called Big Bang. And indeed, perhaps your viewers like the Big Bang Theory. It's nothing to do with Big Bang Theory, although it's a great show, is it not?
It's very funny, yeah.
It's a great show, and it's great how well they did. It always made me laugh, and I was in my 40s and 50s watching it, for goodness sake. I mean, it shows you. Big Bang was, and this is an important context, it was when the investment banks, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and whatever the forerunner of Barclays was in that context, were able to buy the retail banks, as in the Midland Bank, the NatWest, Halifax Building Society, which then became Halifax PLC. And as soon as you put £1,000 into your deposit account, it's in financial markets. And that way, that's the primary reason why debt, or lending should I say, exploded since then, from the late 70s, early 80s, because banks were able to, this is a technical term, securitize, basically get rid of the risk of using your money that you've deposited in the financial markets. Literally, this nanosecond, you put money into the deposit, it's no longer your money. And that's why we have the financial sector compensation scheme, financial services compensation scheme, that if your bank or building society goes bust, then £85,000 in that banking group is secure because they know what could happen.
But even if you've got 250,000, you're only going to get 85.
If your bank goes bust.
Yeah.
Now, let me say, I think it's improbable that the banks will go bust. A big bank may go bust, but if your viewers are particularly wealthy and, as we say, heavy with cash, then they shouldn't mess around. If they're single people, 85,000 per banking group. If they're a couple, a married couple or a civil partnership, 170,000 per banking group, and split it into others if they're heavy with cash.
Yeah.
Just in case, I would say there is a 1%, only 1% probability that there's going to be a banking collapse. I don't expect it. 2008 was a banking collapse. 2024 is a general economic collapse. I do expect a huge iconic company. I don't know. It's not going to be Tesco, but I'll use that as an example. A huge iconic company will go bust. I don't know who it's going to be, but I expect such a company will go bust.
A British company or a global company?
I think there will be an iconic British company that will go bust, and certainly there'll be other global companies. So far we've had Wilco that went bust. In America, Bed Bath & Beyond. These are well-known retail companies. But, you know, they're mid-sized. I think there'll be an iconic company that goes bust.
There are several banks in America that went bust this year, aren't there?
There have been 6 or 7 sizable banks. Now, thank you for raising that, because I mind block. The fact that banks are now going bust, I'm telling you, that in itself tells us that there is something afoot in the global financial system. Banks don't go bust otherwise. So we talked about where money comes from.
Yeah.
So let's go back to the economy.
Yeah.
The medium term is the biggest economic recession in decades, at least back to the 2000s, when we had the last, what I call proper recession, perhaps the early 1990s, which was also a proper recession. People have actually forgotten what proper recession is, but remember, in 2008, as well as bailing everyone out from all the printing, they slashed interest rates from 5 to 0.5. This time they've taken interest rates from 0 to 5.25. They'll bring them down, sure, to 2%. Who knows, maybe even 1%. But we have moved from a step change. We have moved a step change from low inflation world to a higher inflation world. And we're going to be in a higher inflation world for decades. So what does that mean for people? Well, economies don't do well in inflation. Economies do well in falling inflation or deflation. The media tells you, oh, we hate deflation. Oh, it's bad. Oh, deflation's really bad because look at the 1930s. What they tell you about the 1930s is false. Communism created the 1930s. Not that there was a stock market crash from 1929. If they had taken a free market capitalist approach, as they did in 1920, when they then had the roaring 20s, by the way, in 1920-21, we had the biggest depression that never was. Unemployment, the GNP of America went down 24%. Nobody knows about the 1920s. But because they took a free market approach in 21, we had the roaring 20s. But because they took a communist approach in the early 30s, we had the 1930s. But they pretend it was because of the stock market that we had the 1930s. No, the stock market was just one part of it. They could easily have got out of the problem, but they didn't. So because we are going increasingly communist now, that's why we're going to have increasing impoverishment over the long term. In the medium term, particularly post the elections next year, on both sides of the pond, the governments will open the spigots. Now, they may open the spigots before the elections, could well do. Certainly there'll be a reduction in taxes, you'd expect. Maybe there'll be mass printing, particularly if there's a stock market crash in the first half of next year, which I have been writing to people, saying, when I say people, I write a report, the Booms and Bust report, which I think you read, as well as other things that, of course, I write to clients. But the Booms and Bust report is available to anyone.
And I can put all your links on this little chat underneath, so people can.
I think some viewers will find that useful. Yeah. And I don't just talk about markets, talk about economics and how it affects people. But the point is, I think there will be a stock market crash again, and within months, 6-9 months. There are so many economic and markets indicators suggesting it. Post the crash, they may open the spigots, but it'll be like nothing how they open the spigots in 2025, when there'll be nothing I mean, at the moment, there's no political will on either side of the pond for $20 trillion or pounds to be printed. But that will be the case, I expect, in March of 25. And by doing so, yes, the economy will get going again. Interest rates will be lower, mortgage rates will be lower, business loans will be lower, people will have money in their pockets, the economy will get going again, stock market will rise, thank you very much. But of course, what it does, it rekindles the inflation. And we will not get out of the inflation and disinflation cycles, which will come every now 4, 5, 6 years, maybe even 3, 4, 5 years for the next 20 years. Very much like we had in the 60s and 70s. High inflation, low inflation, high inflation, low inflation, stock market boom, stock market crash, stock market boom, stock market crash, and associated economy, up, down, unemployment, up, down, and so on. I believe that what we're going to see in the next 20 years is very similar to what we had in the 60s and 70s. We went back, we talked about what it was like in the 1970s. Many of the younger viewers, they'll need to speak to their parents what it was like in the 1970s. Exactly. Their parents will go, oh my God, it was awful. Well, that's what we're going back to. Let me make one final point. And people really need to get this. If they continue to do what they've done for the last 10 years, 20 years, 40 years, they're going to become increasingly impoverished. Take house prices as one example. We're in a house price crash now. House price is going to fall, say 25% nationally on average. Don't sue me if it's 15% or it's 35%, but it's a house price crash that we haven't seen for a long, long time. And when the house prices start rising again in London in 25, outside of London from 26 is my expectation, my analysis conclusions. Yes, house prices will rise, but for the next 10, 20 years, it will be totally different to what we've had in the last 40 years, when house prices rose above inflation with falling interest rates. House prices will rise post-crash, from 75 pence in the pound, they will rise below inflation. Property and shares, as in pensions, will not be the wealth generator that it has been for the last 40 years. And people need to alter whatever their arrangements have been.
That was a question more or less that I was going to ask. What can people do about this? I think this is quite mind-blowing for a lot of us. There's a lot of information and you're so passionate about it. You know your stuff for sure. And it was kind of for those with wealth or those without wealth. I mean, is it the same thing, changing your lifestyle? If you haven't got any big houses or pensions, are you stuffed?
Again, we'll come back to CBDC in a mo.
Yeah.
But, if you're a normal working person, you're in, shall we say, 30,000 a year. You and your partner, joint income, 50, 60, 70,000 a year. This is not unusual at all. You've got a £150,000 mortgage on your £250,000, £300,000 place, or maybe you've inherited and you've got 400,000 equity in your house. So, you got a much bigger place than your income would normally produce because you've inherited from your parents. Fair enough. A lot of people have. And by the way, there's £6 trillion of money to be inherited. 6 trillion over the next 15 years. There's a lot of money to be inherited. Okay, so that's fine.
Tax there for somebody.
Well, you can easily make arrangements to mitigate inheritance tax. This thing about the inheritance tax bill. It's now 7 billion. I think they said £7 billion. It's the highest inheritance tax ever. Well, that's partly because, of course, property prices have gone up forever until the last couple of years. But it's not difficult to mitigate inheritance tax. It's what I do for a living. But normal folk are already starting to see things tighten. This year, we're practically at the end of the year. This year, nearly 1 million fixed rate mortgages are ending. So their fixed rate mortgages are going from 1 to 2% to 5 to 6%. That's 1 million households seeing their monthly mortgage costs go up 50 to 75%.
I know several people now having been sold their houses and moved to smaller places.
Yeah, can't afford it.
And that is a good strategy, no question. That is a great strategy. Good, well done to them. Do you know anyone who's at a 50%, 75% wage rise?
No, exactly. It's not in keeping.
Exactly.
No, it's not in keeping.
So, and by the way, in 24 and 25, there's another 1.5 million fixed rate mortgages to come to an end. So 2.5 million, which is nearly 20% of all owner-occupier and buy-to-let mortgages, with massive increase in mortgage costs. And by the way, in terms of the interest rate rises, here we are coming to the end of the second half of 2023. Interest rate changes only have an effect on the economy 12 to 18 months after the change. We're only now seeing the effects of the interest rate rises in the first half of 22. In the first half of 24, we'll see the effects of the interest rate rises in the second half of 22. In the second half of next year, we will really, and I mean really, see the effects of the interest rate rises of this year. And it is not going to be fun, I'm afraid to say. So people are already starting to tighten their belts. Instead of 3 holidays a year, it's 1 holiday a year. Instead of going out 3 times a week, it's 1 time a week. Instead of getting Deliveroo to, bloody hell, put the pot on, put the oven on, for goodness sake. And people are suddenly waking up to things just aren't as good as they were. And by the way, we've only in the last couple of months started to see the rise in unemployment. The last couple of months, you will see unemployment soar through 2024. That's the situation for, I'm afraid to say, the next couple or 3 years. What do people need to do? Well, they need to secure their income. Do whatever they need to do to secure their income, if they can. I'm not a job counsellor, but people are smart.
But I mean, because I could say how, and that's challenging, because nowadays, you don't even get a job for life. Like in the old, when I say my dad was a banker, he had a job for life. And when he passed, his pension went on to my mother. Well, those days have gone. I mean, now you don't have contracts for young people. 0 hours contracts for a lot of people. I think that's awful, but they seem to love it because they think, well, they don't have the responsibility, or maybe I don't have to work tomorrow. I don't know. It's a new generation and things change, but I don't know if that's a good thing or not. To me, I wouldn't feel happy about it.
When they're being subsidised by mater and pater, they don't have to worry so much. When they lose that income, but they've still got their rent or mortgage to pay, then they realise things are quite tough after all. And then you've got the people who apparently were in secure jobs, even in the public sector, or the large corporate, the multinational corporate, basically secure jobs. they've seen their costs of living soar.
Yes.
Yes. But then it's the people outside of the, what I call the quasi-public sector, in the SMEs, the small and medium-sized enterprises, the self-employed, unless they've got successful self-employed businesses or practices, they're the people who, and in net zeros, they're the people who are going to be first to be let go. So, as I say, first of all, do whatever you need to do, secure your income. Reduce your spending for good. If you haven't started, do it today. Not tomorrow, start today. Reduce your spending. And if, ladies, if I'm talking rubbish and what I'm saying here doesn't happen, then my goodness, in 2 years' time, people will have thousands of pounds in the bank. Wouldn't that be terrible? Because they've reduced their spending. And by the way, whereas up until 2 years, you got no interest, now you can get 4 or 5 or 6%. So reduce your spending just to be on the safe side. You talk about the wealthy and non-wealthy. Whether you're wealthy or non-wealthy, hasn't everyone got a pension? Hasn't everyone been saving into a pension because they've been in job this and job that, and they started a pension here, they were for 5 years, and then another way for 3 years. They've got. Look at what's inside the pension. Secure it. If there's going to be a stock market crash, get out of the stock market.
Yeah.
My clients are not in the stock market today, the 21st November 2023. So, I'm putting my clients' money where my mouth is.
Which is where? In property? You're saying properties are going to go, pensions going to go, stock market's gone, gold, where? So
right,
where?
Okay, so you just said something I want to pick up on.
Okay.
You said pensions are going to go. No, investments are going to go. A pension is just an investment vehicle. Yeah. Like a stock market ISA, or an investment portfolio. It's just a pot of money that's invested.
Yeah.
So get out of stocks.
Okay.
You within your pension, you can go to, for example, you can go to cash and get 5%. For example, there are other things you can do, but at least stop yourself from losing 25 to 50%, which is what I expect is going to happen in the short to medium term.
But when you take the money out of the pension...
I never said you take it out.
No,
it's still in the
take,
pension.
okay.
It's still inside the pension.
So if it's in a pension fund, you can then reinvest it into buying a forest or something like that, whatever it is that you're buying land.
You can just switch it inside the pension to cash in the short term. And
but you don't take the cash out?
No.
Okay,
no, it's in cash, or it's in what we call a money market fund.
That's interesting.
People can look that up.
Yeah.
You just switch the fund, whatever fund it's in. It's in at the moment it's in the UK stock market, or it's in the global stock market, or it's in whatever.
Yeah.
So take it out inside the pension, but remember, a pension's just an investment vehicle.
Yeah.
It's an investment pot of money that just happens to be inside a pension. Whether it's a Ford or a Vauxhall or a BMW or a Mercedes, it's taking you from A to B. Mm-hmm. So it's just a box in which there's 4 people going from A to B. A pension is just a vehicle which is holding money, whether it's driving at 150 miles an hour or 50 miles an hour. Okay. So move to cash in the pension, in the stocks and shares ISAs, and in other investments. That way you secure the purchasing power of what you've got. And then, if I am right, and the stock market crashes, go back in. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
You go back in at 75 pence in the pound, or if you time it really well, 50 pence in the pound. And when the governments and the central banks open the spigots and reduce interest rates, you watch the stock market. Okay, so that's the first thing you can do. You can reduce your risk to capital in your savings. If you've got a lot of cash and you're only getting 1%, well, you're an idiot, because just go online, get 4, 5, 6%. That's the second thing you should do. In terms of, there are people watching this who might have buy-to-let investments, the so-called accidental landlords. Well, they weren't accidental. They knew what they were doing. And they thought they were intelligent, and they thought, well, I can make money here. And for a long time they did. Well, what's the phrase? They're welcome. They've gone past their welcome. whatever the phrase. The party's over.
Yeah.
I can tell you that making money in property is over. In the short term, property will go down 25%. In the longer term, it'll go up, but below inflation, which means that it will not increase your purchasing power. You got £1 million of property, it goes down to £750,000, it then goes up back to £1 million, but by that time, £1 million is worth 800,000 in inflation adjusted terms. So, should people sell now? Yes. If they've got excess property, they should sell now, but they shouldn't sell at prevailing prices because transactions are down 20 to 30%. They need to market at 10% below prevailing prices to attract interest. And that's their best chance of selling. Otherwise, they're just going to see property go down for the next couple of years.
But does that not just affect them if they've got loans on those properties? If you've got no loan on the property, it's not going to bother you anyway, is it really?
Is that right?
Oh, I'm asking you.
First of all, their wealth is going to go down 25%.
Right. Okay.
In their personal balance sheets.
Right. Yeah. On the paper.
And then secondly, their wealth is then going to grow sub-inflation for the next 20 years. So, which means that their real wealth, in other words, that they can, the things that they can buy, the lifestyle they can buy with the money is going to diminish. Okay. And I've been saying for the last 2 or 3 years that in this generation, started from 2020, 2021, 90% of the Western population is going to see their purchasing power severely diminish. Severely. Simply due to inflation.
Happy days, Rebekah.
Well, actually, in a way, I don't think it's bad.
But exactly, because that's my point. People can do something about it.
Because they know.
And I go back to something that I just said. If you still do what you've done, as Einstein said, you're going to get the results you've always got. Yeah. But if you alter what you've done, and by the way, what does that mean? Well, if property did well for the last 40 years, then get out of property. If shares generally did well over the last 40 years, get out of shares. Instead, what will do well in inflation? Because remember what we've had for 40 years is falling inflation. So what will do well in inflation? Oil, copper, mining, farming, what we call commodities, getting things out of the ground. Yes? They will do well. So in the stock market crash, focus in your pension on investing in energy companies, in commodity companies, in farming companies. Let's now look at gold, shall we? Gold's done nothing for the last 3 years, $2,000 an ounce, I think in dollars, not in pounds. Yeah. Yes, it's done well in pounds, but that's because the pound has done badly. But it's done nothing for 3 years now. Everyone says buy gold. Well, if I'd bought gold, I'd have achieved zero for 3 years. In the very short term, yes, I can see gold going to 2,100, 2,200, 5 or 10%. It's hardly going to change your life. In the stocks crash, which I expect, I think gold will go down 15 to 30%, as it did in 2008, as it did in 2020. Should you then buy more gold? Sure, why not? But when you've read up about gold, what have you read? You've read gold's going to $5,000, going to $10,000. Well, okay. So if it goes from $1,600 or $1,800 or $1,900 to $5,000, yes, okay, you'll have made 150%. Definitely a very good return. But it's not going to change your life. And how much gold not only can you buy, how much can you store? How much gold can you store? By the way, silver will do far better than gold. But silver is 100 times the amount of space of gold. How much silver can you buy and store? So these are the practical limitations. Sure, if there's a 15-30% fall in gold, if you've got £50,000, sure, buy gold, buy silver. You can store that somewhere. Let me know where it is. No. Don't. Yes, bury it in the ground if you want, but make sure at least one other person knows.
Yeah, remember it. Yeah.
Actually, and I know a lot of freedom people will say this is nonsense. I think for the medium term, for the next few years at least, it's fine to store it in a London vault, and it costs you 0.5% a year. That's basically fine. That's okay. What I, as an investor, as a professional investor, will do, however, if gold goes down 15 to 30%, gold mining companies will go down 25 to 50%. So, in 2008 to 2000, or early 09 to early 11, gold mining companies went up 200%. In 2020, from the end of March 20 to the summer of 20, they went up 200%, 5 months. In 2016, from December 15 to July of 16, 200%. There's something about the correlation between the mining share prices, which get absolutely hammered, with the gold price. When the gold price then does that, gold miners rocket. So as an investor, people should know that if they see gold mining companies, and there are lots of funds in gold mining for their pension funds, if they see gold mining companies do that, boom, get in. But not, as we say, don't marry it. Have a fling for 3, 5, 7 months, take the money and then get out. In other words, go back to cash, take the money and run. And then you could buy a whole load of gold, whole load of silver with your spoils, and you could hold that for the long term, inside or outside your pension. I'll tell you something else. If gold does become $5,000, $7,000 an ounce, this world is going to be Mad Max.
Oh, don't.
This is going to be post-apocalyptic.
Yeah.
We will never go back to a gold standard, which is what we freedom people say that we should have. It will never happen because the parasites will never let it happen. If somehow it does, but I give it a 1% probability, your gold will not be confiscated. They will pay you the prevailing price. But then, if then we go to Mad Max and then goes to $100,000 an ounce, you won't benefit from it there from then on. But at least you'll have benefited it to then. But people should not dream of $5,000 an ounce gold. Be careful what you wish for. Bitcoin and Ethereum, for me, are the only cryptos of any value. I think there may be 2 or 3 or 4 other cryptos which I don't know about, but to me, crypto, it's just not investable, unless you're an insider. I'm not an insider. Focusing on Bitcoin, it's not an investment. It's a speculation device. Yeah. Anything that goes from $3,000 to $68,000 is not an investment. It's a bubble.
Yeah, it was gambling, isn't it, really?
I think in the crash next year, I think Bitcoin will again crash. Actually, like gold miners and indeed shares, that's probably a good time to go in. But again, don't marry it.
Yeah.
Have a fling. And you hear about people who made 10,000%. Well, that's fine. That's like 1 in 100 people.
Yeah.
Of people who are in that market.
Yeah.
It's a speculation device. Look, people need to preserve their purchasing power, preserve their income. In terms of growing your own food and your own communities and all the rest of it. That's not what I'm here to talk about.
No.
That's for other people to talk about. Working on the basis that for the next few years, there is relative normality in the sense of economic cycles and financial market cycles. But then we come to CBDC, universal basic income, feudalism, 15-minute cities.
Could I ask you, do you think universal basic income will actually come in?
Yeah, of course. I don't think.
Why?
Because the feudalists want it to happen, and what they want, they get.
And universal basic income, for anybody who doesn't know anything about it, is basically a handout from the government to every person of a certain amount. I think they're trialling it in Finchley and somewhere up north at the moment. They've got 60 people on £1,600 a month, and they're trialling it for 2 years to find out how it affects them, their lives, their attitude towards work, their mental health. And they tried to bring this in back in the 60s, didn't they?
Did they? I didn't
They
know
did,
that.
and it was squashed. And I think there were a lot of sort of especially creative people who were, like freelance designers today, that income up and down and all over the place, who were actually welcoming that idea.
Right.
So what's your opinion on the effect of universal basic income if that is brought in on?
Well, I heard about North Korea and Soviet Union and Cuba. Communism doesn't work. It works for the parasites, doesn't work for the people. That's what UBI is.
It's a form of control. Yeah.
It's communism, it's feudalism. Communism, socialism, corporatism, fascism, cronyism, all these isms, it's just feudalism. The king or queen, the courtiers, and everyone else. That's all it is. Capitalism is the only thing that took us out of feudalism. And yet, people don't get that because the media has brainwashed, indeed most freedom people, that capitalism is bad. It screws people, it uses people. No, capitalism is what took us out of the gutter into the middle classes, where we actually had 2 meals a day rather than bread and cheese. And it gave us inside toilets. That's what capitalism did. Look at China, where you had 1 billion people living in an agrarian society, eating rice and water every day. All of a sudden, they're living in apartment blocks in the city, and they've got a job. Now, by the way, don't get me wrong, China is a semi-communist society, and it's increasingly communist, but capitalism for 25 years brought 1 billion people out of extreme poverty. But you never hear that in the media, and freedom people need to get their head examined if they think capitalism's a bad thing. But universal basic income, well, that aligned with central bank digital currency, which is what they now have in China, where if you don't toe the line, you can't walk into their equivalent of Sainsbury. And if you say something that you shouldn't say, then we're going to have to reduce your UBI this month until you toe the line, and that's the smallest effect of UBI. I mean, the harshest effects you can't even you can imagine, but it's horrendous. And then align that with the WHO International Treaty. Well, then you've got Aldous Huxley's Brave New World.
I think actually on that note, Brave New World, because we've gone on for quite.
Have we?
Yeah. It's been well over now.
Fascinating.
It is. I think we have to come back another time and I'm blown away by some of it.
So many more questions I want to ask you, and I know you've just got a wealth of knowledge that is invaluable. Did you make it all up?
That's not true.
Well, thank you for entertaining us in the afternoon. And as we're all going to be so poor, I'm going to take all the chocolate biscuits with me.
Yeah, do
yes, I'll have the jelly and the cats.
Can I tell you a gag I heard about crypto?
Yeah. To end on, we're going to end on a happy.
Yeah.
Because
Well, I don't know if it's happy.
No, all right. You'd have to tell us a happy joke.
Because I'm reminded that I read recently that Paris Hilton is going to set up a cryptocurrency.
Okay.
And that reminded me of an article I read, tittle tattle, several years ago. We're all adults here. She made a sex video in a hotel room. The poor parents. The shame. It was a Marriott hotel.
on that note, that is terrible. We could have done with that on Saturday. Actually, it's quite good. Thank you very much.
You're very
Thank you
welcome.
so much, Jonathan.
Thank you for coming.
No,
It's been my pleasure.
Yeah.
It's been exhausting,
It
actually.
has.
taking it all in.
Yeah.
I need a drink.
Yeah, I need a drink. Get the scotch out. So everybody, if you have liked that information and you have any questions, please put it in the comments. Please also subscribe to our Wise Women weekdays, and we will come back and speak with Jonathan if he'll have us.
Sure.
And so the questions, bring them in.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Right.
Right. Yeah.